Unprecedented demand.
Circumstances.
There is no poetry in saying that $1 was worth 1,500 Lebanese pounds up until this past October. Now it's worth 7,500 Lebanese pounds. Prices have more than quadrupled. There is no poetry in the word quadrupled. There is no poetry in numbers. There is no poetry in hunger. There is no poetry in the man who shot himself in Hamra Street, leaving a note saying, "I am not blasphemous, but hunger is blasphemous." There is no poetry in a pandemic that took hundreds of lives in Lebanon and hundreds of thousands of lives in the world. And there definitely is no poetry on August 4th, 2020, when the third biggest non-nuclear explosion in the world shook the port of the city and devastated Beirut. And maybe there will be no poetry after it. This is not a poem. I am too tired to write one. I am too tired for metaphors. I will not say that the Beirut blast was like... It was like nothing else. It just was. It was, and then nothing. And then everything. I will not describe it. You've seen the news. But this is what I will tell you. Our government is killing us. Slowly, sure, but make no mistake, it is killing us. And this is what I will tell you. On October 17th, 2019, a revolution began in Lebanon. And I will tell you that began is the wrong word choice here. We started it. Around 10 p.m., we started getting news of people gathering and protesting in Beirut, and then in different cities and towns around the country. I couldn't sit still. I joined the thousands of people in downtown Beirut. The chant was clear. One word, repeated, yelled, screamed, revolution. This is what I will tell you. We were an angry body. We were an angry, hopeful body. We are doomed by hope. This is what Saadallah Wannous said. We had everything and nothing to lose. At 6 a.m., I would wake up and take my sleepy eyelids to a street nearby, join other people and protest. The sun is barely up. Everything is blue. One young man found an old washing machine thrown on the side of the street. He dragged it to the middle of the road and sat on it. A woman carried a big potted plant and placed it next to the washing machine. Then she pushed a big trash can and set it next to the plant. She sat on the lid of the trash can, crossed her legs, and held the Lebanese flag in her right hand and waved it to passers-by. We were spending the day and night there. An elderly woman saw us from her balcony, and a few minutes later she came down to the street with a big pot of coffee, cups, and a bowl of sugar. "Stay strong," she told us. "Fight. Do it better than us. We failed. Do it for us." More people joined, hitting pots with wooden spoons, making music. Some had drumsticks and used them to play percussions on the traffic light pole. We made music. The sun came up. Everything was golden. I looked at us. We were poetry. But I will tell you this, nights were different. They suffocated us with tear gas, they hit us, they shot us, rubber bullets, live ammunition, arrested us, humiliated us. They are killing us. Make no mistake. We took the wounded to the hospital. We gave slices of onion and white vinegar to people who couldn't breathe or see from the tear gas. It helps. Smell this. Pour this on your eyes. This is revolutionary love. And in the morning we would gather again, pick up the trash from the streets, the broken glass, the empty water bottles, the cigarette butts. We recycled everything. Then we would have coffee and do it all over again. But I will tell you this, we were struck with a pandemic, a devastating economic collapse. The banks are holding our money and savings hostage. The government's corruption and neglect led to the death of hundreds and the injury of thousands, the displacement of hundreds of thousands. The government is killing us. Entire streets have disappeared. My body tenses. It is alert when a car backfires. Do we run? There is no poetry in crippling fear. We don't sleep at night. Our sleep is not restful. We wake up soaked in sweat. I talk to my parents. I tell them I can't sleep. They tell me it's been this way for as long as we can remember. This is Lebanon. A sentence said in resignation. I read this once, I don't know where. And for a while it appeared that our only legacy would be desertion. So many of us have left the country. I understand them. There is too much smoke from the fire on the horizon to see any future for us here, but make no mistake, so many of us are here. And in the morning, we take helmets, shovels, gloves, brooms, and we make our way to rebuild the city. Let me tell you this. We are tired of resilience. Why can't we have coffee at home? Why do we always grab it on our way to demand a better country, to rebuild a country? We are tired. We rebuild. Make no mistake, we are tired. Make no mistake, we rebuild together. Make no mistake, we are leaving. Make no mistake, our love is revolutionary. And I will tell you this, change is coming.
Welcome to the Performance Theater. It's fantastic to be together after a year that has tested us as communities, as organizations, as individuals in so many ways. That beautiful piece was created for us by Beirut-based writer and actress Dima Matta and filmed and edited by Mona Adib. Some of you will have the opportunity to meet Dima later on today. And in our first conversation with her about this session, Dima described the days after the Beirut explosion, and she said that one of the memories that will stay with her is the sound of citizens on the street sweeping up broken glass for days. This eerie image, I think, captures how many of us have been feeling this year, the feeling that things have been broken and maybe broken for a long time. The feeling that we have to somehow find the strength to put those broken things back together. In this moment, we have the opportunity to reassemble, to put the pieces back together in different ways, in ways that we think can lead to more sustainable, more inclusive societies and growth. And we also have the opportunity to reassemble in the sense of gathering again, in the sense of gathering again, including with people who may have become distanced from us long before lockdown became an idea in our heads. We also have the opportunity to come together, not necessarily in person, but in intent. Our own community is reassembling today after a longer than usual time apart. You've all come here to this imaginary space from all over the world. Some of you have just woken up in Los Angeles and Seattle. Some of you are starting your day in New York or Sao Paulo. Some of you are wrapping up your week with us in Oslo or London or Istanbul or Beirut. Some of you have stayed up late to be with us in New Delhi and Singapore. And one of you has even joined us from New Zealand. If you see Deborah Emanuel later, please wish her a happy birthday. We will kick off today with a conversation with three people who were working on finding ways to make our economies and societies more inclusive even before the events of 2020. We'll have a wonderful discussion, I think, with Ajay Banga, the CEO of Mastercard, Majora Carter, an urban revitalisation strategist, and Katharine Wilkinson of Project Drawdown. You'll have a chance for a short break and an opportunity to catch up with each other in the platform that you've just, in some cases, gotten a chance to see. And then we'll divide up into some smaller groups for more focused discussions on topics related to this question of inclusive growth. And then finally, we'll come back together again for some closing remarks and reflections on the way ahead for the performance theater from our founder, Oswald Bjelland, and our new advisory board chairman, Hans Vestberg. We're all using a technology that's new to us, so thank you so much in advance for your patience. And if my head falls off or something, we'll have to keep rolling with it. I'm wearing shoes, but not all of you have to be doing so. This is it's a new era. We're going to have just a few quick housekeeping reminders. If you would like to use social media to share with your networks what you're experiencing here in the Performance Theater, please feel free to do so. We're at hashtag TPT 2020 and hashtag the Performance Theater. But do please respect the safe space and don't attribute quotes to speakers without their express permission. All right. Well, without any further ado, I'd like to welcome my three panelists to join me here on our virtual stage. We have Ajay, Majora, and Katharine, who all happen to be joining us from Eastern Time in the US. Ajay, let me start with you. Have the past 6 months, when you think about the ways that you've been working on inclusive growth over really more than a decade, have the past 6 months changed the way that you think about what this phrase inclusive growth means and the kind of leadership that it will require?
So hi, Sai, and Majora and Katharine, it's a pleasure to be in this virtual panel with you. We've kind of all got used to virtual stuff, and I was telling someone jokingly the other day that the new catchphrase is, "Can you hear me now?" Because that's typically all of us trying to get off mute, right? So it's nice to be together. Your question, it's been the oddest period of time that I think I've ever seen in my 60 years of being around. And I have never lived through such a difficult period in so many ways. The pandemic is just a part of it, and we're meant to life and misery and all the rest of it. But it's also, if you live in the US, it's next to impossible to not be very conscious and feel extremely disturbed by the events on race that have happened yet again. The problem is the words "yet again." And that to me is the underlying issue that is below so many of the things around inclusion. So I said this in previous performance theater sessions. My general belief is that the world's problems fit on three sides of a triangle. One side is one versus many. That's the entire story of inclusion. That is not just financial inclusion, it's gender inclusion, it's racial inclusion, it's inclusion of your sexual orientation, it's being left out because you weren't born in the right place at the right time. That is one side of the triangle. The other side of the triangle is humanity versus nature. And that's got everything to do with the planet and ecology and drinking water and clean air and forest fires and denial of climate change and all the things we talk about fit on that one. And then unfortunately, the foundation that keeps this stupid triangle surviving all our efforts is the long-term versus short-term nature of decision-making. So whether you're a politician or you're a CEO, the system incents you to think shorter rather than longer. And these problems on the first two sides of the triangle don't lend themselves to short-term solutions. And so if you think about the pandemic, it just put a Bunsen burner under this triangle and made it worse. This is not a new issue. It's just got worsened through the pandemic, and it's got worsened in my eyes for the manner in which the Black Lives circumstance in the US has got exposed yet again. And so, my general view is that if you want to fight this, we have to stop treating it like a new event or something we just woke up to. These are historical problems that if we don't put our shoulder to the wheel, then shame on us for what we leave behind for our kids. And I think that is the way we've got to first energize ourselves around it. The second part is the pandemic has shown that we're actually an interconnected world. If anything, the one thing you can't do by putting up walls is you can't prevent viruses from coming in. And I think that's the issue, that this hyper-nationalism, this hyper-populism, this hyper-anti-globalization, all that is fine for elections. It's not fine when you have to fight something that doesn't recognize borders. And I think the third thing that struck me very hard is the fact that even though governments have done enormous effort to throw resources at the problem in an economic sense, fiscal resources, monetary resources, and some governments have done an outstanding job as well on the health front. We're all learning about these. The problem is there isn't enough money in government coffers to be able to solve these issues. And so if the private sector and the public sector do not partner together in a form that brings private sector ingenuity, capital, people, skills, and technology to the party, and we don't start trusting each other more in the private and public sectors to find the right way to get past this, we just never will. There is not enough money in philanthropy or government to do this without the resources of the private sector being applied to this as a commercially sustainable solutions that we must hunt for. And so all I'm saying is this is not new. It feels like it's just the deja vu. We're having this discussion again and again. But I do believe that the three sides of the triangle require us to have a slightly more than short-term view, requires us to work deeply with trust between the private and the public sector on bringing resources together in a commercially sustainable way to fight these issues. And it requires us to think about these as issues that will not go away if we don't really do something about it in the time we have. I can give you examples of what we're doing and so on, but that's not the point. The point is that's what we need to do.
Thank you, Ajay. Majora, I'm curious if you would agree. If you think about the work that you've been doing in the South Bronx for a decade, does it feel like this is a new moment for us to tackle inclusion in a different way? Is there enough money, and just we need different types of systems to help that money get to the places that it isn't getting to right now?
Majora, you're on mute.
Exactly. I wish I could say that this is a very different place that America's been in, but it's been 400 years. It's just a different iteration of it, especially as it relates to race and class here. And, and I absolutely agree with Ajay. This is going to be, the kind of public-private partnerships that must happen. It's always needed to happen in that regard. But it's like, for example, because government has been throwing money and stuff, but there's still issues, that I think, just are outside of the realm of government as well. So, but one of the things that, because I want to, mention that, just using a personal example, I was actually, so Ajay, I was a part of the Mastercard Center for Social Inclusion when they started working in the South Bronx, which was an amazing, experience to be a part of, and really started to understand how the company was working to really, create that kind of financial independence and support, and technology as well. And I actually founded a tech social enterprise called Startup Box. And basically our goal was to do urban onshoring and create entry-level jobs, within the tech sector for, people from communities like mine in the South Bronx, which is a poor community of color, because there was a big issue about the tech divide and getting people involved into entry-level jobs. And we realized that there was like a sliver within the quality assurance world that actually would be better served doing it here rather than offshoring it. And we got clients to do it. We employed folks. Often it was their first job. It was truly amazing. But here I was, and they got their first job and then they were able to move on. But the interesting thing is I was basically a Black female tech founder. And in America, that's practically invisible when it comes down to financing, obtaining financing, in the form of any kind of capital, whether it's loans or, or even investments, within to support this company. And so I ended up folding that company because I literally just could not get it to scale. I couldn't get the financing to do so because, again, as Black females, it's just harder for us to get capital here in this country. But then I watched, two different white men with the exact same idea literally get all the capital they needed and scale after I closed mine. And it was just like, even though we were known, we won awards for the whole thing. And it was, but again, and I don't say that just to make you feel sorry for me, because I don't, but it does serve as an indication of what the issue is. And so, but it's a systemic issue that we're dealing with. It has nothing that has as much to do with the fact that, money has been misdirected in a lot of different ways that doesn't support the well-being of the fact that white supremacy has been used in this country to literally make people feel as though they're less important. And policies, public policies have been used in order to make sure that their quality of life, in particular their economic quality of life, their educational quality of life, is not something that could actually, that they could even move forward. So I think it's really, truly important that there is, not just the capital that goes into it, from the public and the private sector, but it's also just recognizing that we need to make sure that we're supporting the people on the ground to do it, and the ones who are most affected by it. Like, it should never be, this kind of type of missionary kind of thing that happens to our communities. And that's honestly the way it has almost always happened. It's almost as if, poverty is a cultural attribute and our race is something that diminishes us. So of course, someone from the outside has to come in and support us, in order to make things better. And surprisingly, that's one of the reasons why I believe, that since there's been no trust, in us being the keys to our own economic recovery, and things are done to us and for us rather than with us, and assuming that there's folks that can do exactly what needs to be done in terms of restoring our own communities, environmentally, economically, and socially. Why is it that financing, that there are so few tech founders, that actually get the kind of capital, to scale their businesses, of color rather, and it's, again, it speaks to, the idea that white supremacy has really created what we're looking at right now. So it's obviously not the first time. Again, America's had 400 years of practice doing this. And not to beat up on my own country, but it happens all over the world as well. So I know this isn't just specific to us, but unless we're willing to actually identify and support the folks on the ground who actually have the ideas to help make this happen, and the training and the expertise as well, because that was another thing that I thought was really interesting within the tech, when people would talk about tech talent, it was like 25% of graduates, in this country in engineering school and computer science are actually of color, but they represent only about 5% of the people employed in the tech sector total, or rather Black and brown ones. And that's something that we should look at. Like, why are we saying that there's somehow something that we don't have the assets within our own communities to support this development in any way, when we could actually be the keys to our own recovery, and with support, so that we can work to create the kind of world that we'd all be proud of being in.
Thank you, Majora. And something that you just described, I think, connects to something you and I, Catherine, were talking about. I guess it was last week. I know you're feverishly finishing a book right now, where you're thinking very much about how solutions to the kinds of sticky problems like climate change that we haven't yet managed to solve with our incumbent systems, how those solutions might come from people who aren't currently represented at the table where many decisions are made. How do you see us moving forward out of the kind of deadlock we seem to be in, and starting to find ways to make decisions that move us faster on climate change and other topics?
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate what you were sharing, Majora. And I think I spend my days in the climate movement, and we see a similar dynamic that so many of the most transformational leaders in the space cannot get access to the capital that is needed to do their most powerful and important work. And too much of that work is happening on nights and weekends as a side hustle, with too few hands. And so I really do think about the climate crisis, but this sort of simultaneity of crises that we're in as a leadership crisis, right? And the leadership that has kind of been in service of the dominant status quo system, I don't think is going to be the same leadership that transforms that system into something that is more just and more inclusive, not just for all human beings, but for the planet. I really appreciate, Ajay, your triangle, because it's very clear that the current economy is not inclusive of the planet's living systems. And it's been sort of wild to watch so much of the conversation about the climate crisis kind of hushed down, right, in this moment. Even as we see media coverage of hurricanes and fires breaking records, there are so few instances of media connecting the dots to the crisis that has created this mess. And yet we know that this decade requires us to do more rapid and radical transformation of every sector of the global economy than we've ever fathomed doing, right? And so I think it's, Ajay, as you were talking, I was thinking about this really interesting tension between holding this focus on the urgency of the moment, because, in planetary and scientific terms, we are literally standing at a crossroads of peril and possibility, and keeping the long-term view in mind, right? Thinking about ourselves in this moment as kind of uniquely powerful ancestors. And so, I think part of it is that perspective. Part of it is creating this opening for the biggest and strongest team possible to lead us forward. And the piece of that I have been thinking about a lot is around particularly women's climate leadership. And we know that access to decision-making tables and resources, et cetera, is that much harder for women in the global South, Indigenous women, Black women, other women of color. And my kind of co-collaborator, conspirator, partner in good trouble, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, and I really believe that it's going to take a feminist climate renaissance to lead us forward. So that kind of upwelling of more heart-centered, care-centered, justice-centered leadership, we think is really what we need to get to the kinds of sort of livable future scenarios that we still do have some kind of sliver of possibility to work towards.
Thanks, Catherine. Ajay, when you think about leadership and the different kind of leadership that navigating this moment will require, and that idea that Catherine described of trying to hold both the very long-term and the very short-term realities in our heads at the same time, how do you see, sitting with a private sector lens on, how do you see the role of the private sector changing? Do you see that the way that we think about the role of corporations in driving changes like the ones ahead of us, has that role changed? Is there a different way that companies and their leaders need to be engaging in some of these challenges?
Well, the first thing is I think we should have a few more women in leadership. It'll help a lot. Because when I was describing the triangle, I used to say for the nature one, I used to call it man versus nature. But everybody who surrounds me in my communications team has been trying to change it to humanity versus nature. And the reason why I said man versus nature, because I think men are actually more destructive to nature than women are. It's just reality. If you look at the way men behave and the toys they collect and the things they do, it's a real issue. And I think we need to call out that as well in a funny way. But as I was laughing when Katharine was talking about women and their role, and I was just thinking, if you could get a few more women in positions of power, maybe we'll all do a little better. But that's a sideshow. It's not really what you asked me about. I just couldn't resist that. So
and here we are ganging up on you as well.
Yeah, no, I'm perfectly happy getting ganged up on. And at home, I have three. I have a wife and two adult daughters who, trust me, are worth every ounce of energy that you could get from them. If you could absorb that, we'd all be better families. I believe in this. I think men should have daughters. It makes them better people. But anyway, so again, I'm getting sidetracked. You asked me a very specific question about corporations and leadership. I would tell you that companies, most CEOs, most people in companies, they come to work believing they're doing a good thing. There are very few people who come to work saying, I'm coming to work to screw everybody else so I can make $1. That's not how companies run, no matter what we think about them. I'm sure there are some who do that, don't get me wrong, but I don't believe that's the way it works. I think what's happening is a few things. First is that long-term versus short-term angle. If you incent people to think, in the words of Milton Friedman, that it's all about the shareholder, and that's what's happened for the past 30, 40 years in American capitalism, then you will tend to focus on a certain way of behaving and conducting your business in response to that system and that ecosystem, which includes quarterly analysts and quarterly earnings calls and quarterly targets and your bonuses and your stock price and your compensation. And that becomes the way that people tend to operate very well for that ecosystem. But maybe that ecosystem, like everything else, needs to be thought through. I believe capitalism has done a lot to improve the way we all live and do things. But like any other system, it has faults and it needs guide rails and it needs fixing and it needs evolution to the world we're living in. So if I give this example to people about technology, and we just had Majora talk about her experience there. To me, the internet and the Internet of Things and the things we could do with it and the data that we could get, I mean, this is an unbelievable leveler of the playing field for people. When I was young, to understand anything about the Galapagos, you had to buy the Encyclopedia Britannica. Couldn't afford it. Today, you Google it. Everybody can. And so technology is the ultimate creator of a level playing field, but only if the people who manage it and the people who allow that ecosystem to work do it with the objective of keeping it as a level playing field. If you do it with the objective of making it yours so you can be the winner and the other is the loser, well, then things start happening. It's the same for data. If you say that data is very powerful in helping you do all kinds of things, but you then start to use that only so you're the winner and somebody else is not, well, then bad things happen with data. So to me, it's all about conducting your leadership in a way that recognizes that the ecosystem cannot be only about shareholders. It has to be about more than that. And that's the point of corporate leadership that I think a number of companies are talking about. I've seen change in the Business Roundtable talking about this with their stakeholder capitalism point. I've seen it in so many of my colleagues when I meet them. They get it. I mean, at the end of the day, banks are lending money in neighborhoods. Should they do more? Yes. Are they doing it fairly? Probably they can do it much better. But the problem is, how do you get them to do that better? And how do you get the right kind of money to be available to the right kind of institutions with the right kind of underwriting, with the right kind of approach? So somebody like Majora is not denied the opportunity to be a successful entrepreneur in her own right. That to me is what needs fixing. That needs real leadership in each of these institutions, as well as I said, the partnership and the resources. But it comes from leadership.
So, Majora, that question almost perfectly, I think, tees up another thing that I wanted to ask you. So, I mean, if one of the issues that you've described stems from the fact that a lot of the allocation of capital, the decisions that get made are made in a kind of a top-down way, and where the top happens to be is very far away in all sorts of, literal and metaphorical senses from where the actual capital needs to get to. How could we imagine a system that is less top down, that actually sees more bottom up decisions about resource allocation?
Right. I mean, it is about policy. I mean, it's about the political will, even within a company or a government deciding that this is going to happen, period. Like if by chance, banks, after the 2008 crisis, I think it was a perfect example. There were big banks that were bailed out, but actually regular people, the fact that they got to that point in the first place, people were allowed to kind of like pursue the American dream, but really in the service mostly of, the investors within the market that knew how to work it, not actually in service of people building their wealth. Many people bought the idea of the American dream. And that's why it was so destructive and people wanted it so badly. And, but the bottom line is immediately after that, and to this current day, if you look at the capital that is going into many of our communities, much of it has to do with as much predatory speculation and predatory banking as was prior to the 2008 crisis. So who's getting the capital in order to build their own wealth? It's not going to folks on the ground. But, and some of it has to do, again, I really believe with, look, the fish rots from the head. So are we actually saying, look, we want to make sure that we're going to make real decisions that support people where they are? Like, are we going to actually look at different ways that people can show their credit worthiness if they never trusted banks or if there weren't literally banks in their communities? Because there are many communities around this country where it's not, there are pawn shops, there are check cashing stores, there are rent-a-centers, so you can like buy like what you need in your home, but at a ridiculous rate. But there aren't banks and there aren't credit unions. So how can you help address people's, real needs to understand how capital moves, how they can become credit worthy themselves if they're not given an opportunity to do that? If this stuff is not rocket science, it absolutely is not. When you're given an opportunity, just to show that this is possible, if there were banks who actually bothered, to come into communities and really worked with people who were unbanked or badly banked, and show them, tools around financial literacy to get them to the point of financial independence. If there were different ways, to support, and there are small opportunities. I think there are great examples, albeit small, of companies and not-for-profits that actually work to be that kind of lender to groups that will look at the overall, whether it's the vision of what people are trying to create, and what they've done to create that vision, and then assume the credit of risk proportionally, because they know eventually that folks are going to pay them back. And they've developed a real, I think, amazing algorithms to figure that stuff out and support people there. But again, if there isn't, a kind of support system that actually supports people to move up that ladder, the same thing will happen. I mean, I honestly could still remember, again, a story from my own experience. I was born and raised in the neighborhood that I own actually 2 properties in right now. When I bought my second property, I squatted my first one because no one believed in this community. Like, you could literally like go into a home and people were just like, so what? No one wants it. I made it legal. And then acquired it legally. and then I've decided to buy another one when the opportunity arose. And I literally had to write a letter to my bank because they were just like, well, why would you want another property? Isn't one enough? And I was just like, and I knew that they didn't ask white people this, but they will ask the Black lady who's trying to buy an investment property in her own community. I had to sort of prove my worthiness and that I wasn't going to do anything bad with it. It was a truly humiliating time. And I could only imagine, what, my ancestors, have gone through. But the thing is, that was 2010. I got the house eventually because guess what? I wrote the letter and I was like, okay, fine. I'll be the little thing you think I am, just so I can get my property. But I also know that it is a frustrating thing for people to go through, so much so that if there isn't actually an invitation in the form of policies and practices that make it so folks can actually participate, then what we will continue to see, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's more social unrest and racial unrest in particular, we will always be at this point, especially in this country, where that pursuit of the American dream is literally, the pursuit, that doesn't include actually now the bulk of the population. But again, this stuff isn't rocket science. All it takes somebody going.
So can I add something to that?
Go for it, Ajay.
I'll give you an example of exactly what she's referring to. This idea of underwriting for credit in ways that are different than the usual way of looking at a credit report, which you could not have built if you weren't formally banked. It's really not rocket science. She's absolutely correct. But look at the challenges in doing it. We launched this idea of saying, let's go and give credit to women who open a store outside their home in an African country, started there, because the husband and kid go away the day and she runs a little store for a while. The problem is she can only operate in cash because nobody will give her credit. So she runs out of the produce that she buys. The company van from Nestle comes on a Monday and you leave on a Tuesday. She runs out of the money to store up till the next Monday or the next Tuesday. If you could give us some credit, she'd do a great job and run it well, but nobody will lend to her. So we said, but we have a record of what all she's buying from that company. You can digitize that record and underwrite the transactions using AI and algorithms. And so technology can be a friend here. So we get this all going. We get Unilever, we get a local bank. We do all this. We're not the lenders. We're tech people and data people. We get that going. And then the central bank of that country says to the bank that is lending the money, oh, those are risky loans. We're going to attach a higher risk-weighted capital cost to it, which means they are now disincented to do the business. So then we get to the central bank and we spend 6 months arguing with them to prove to them that this is actually a better way of underwriting. And then they say, oh yeah, you're right. And then they change it. Now, how many times can you do that? And in how many instances will you actually succeed in making a difference to the life of a hot dog vendor or a woman who's opened a store? That's the problem. So when we made a commitment to reach 500 million people for financial inclusion in 2014, I had no idea how we'd get there. We got there in 2020. We've now said we'll reach 1 billion by 2025, including 50 million micro SMEs and 25 million women entrepreneurs. So people like Majora don't have to say this again, at least some of them. The challenge is, the only way you can do that is by making it part of your business model, because the checkbook won't work. So we've made it part of our commercially sustainable business model because we think it's in our interest to do this, because if the community develops, they will use electronic forms of payment. If they do, it'll be good for my company. And so you have to find a way to take these issues and realize that they can be done the right way. The same for climate change. We're launching something called the Priceless Planet Coalition. The idea there is, don't just talk carbon offsets and carbon taxes that nobody understands among the individual, but make them feel they can make a difference by planting trees. So we're going to go with partners and we're going to tell people, hey, use the subway. Instead of taking a taxi, we'll plant a tree for you. And on an app, you can track how many trees you planted. And we've committed to planting 100 million trees in the next 3 years. People can make a difference, companies can make a difference, but you got to make it part of your business model. What's my business model there? I'll get more loyalty from that consumer. You have to view things with the right lens. And instead of putting the money only on some marketing, try and put it on something that makes a difference and energizes people.
Katharine, a few people have now said it's not rocket science. The solutions are all there. We know where we need to get to. We're making progress, but the progress is too slow. And Project Drawdown and a lot of your work has very beautifully laid out exactly what the solutions for climate change could look like. So, if there is some inertia that's preventing us from moving as quickly as we need to, and some of that inertia stems from structures that are in place now, and don't get dismantled or replaced in a day. It takes sort of generations to get those next leaders into position. Can you think of any sort of shortcuts or innovative ways for us to speed up this leadership regeneration process?
Yeah. I mean, I love Majora's focus on policies and practices. And for me, so much of this boils down to listening, right? Whose voices are informing what the policies and the practices are, who ultimately gets to say yay or nay to a particular policy or practice. And I think the question is sort of, how do you actually operationalize better listening, right? And we know that, even, I think, as Ajay said, like, lots of folks in the corporate world are well-intentioned, or they're certainly not setting out to destroy a livable planet. But that is what the current economy is doing. And so we have to change that so fast. We can either change it or the planet is going to change it. I mean, we sort of have one choice or the other. So to me, there's a question of like, well, how can we rapidly infuse perspectives that look out 7 generations, that pay attention to all communities, that have a sense of physically what is unfolding with an atmosphere that already the human species has never survived within. The conditions that we have created are unknown to the human species. I mean, this is mind-boggling. So, the youth climate movement, for example, I think is doing such an amazing job of merging imagination and moral clarity and scientific rigor. Can we actually just go on and have them at the decision-making table? Could every CEO of every public company have a youth activist as their kind of co-decision maker? Could we have people who have a fiduciary responsibility on boards to represent the earth? I think some of these kinds of, sort of, we can't wait for this next generation to make their way up through the hierarchies because we don't have time, but we need their vision and we need their voices and perspectives. So I would love to see kind of more radical experimentation with those sorts of ideas. Yeah.
Thanks, Katharine. Majora, you look like you had another thought on the back of that.
No, I just had this beautiful thought of like all of the young climate activists, like literally sitting, at these tables, and it just made me really happy. So that's really it.
Yeah.
I used to say in our company that every time you sit at a table, you should keep one chair empty, and that chair represents the consumer who's not in the room, and you're making some crazy decisions. Just remember what she's really thinking about you. Maybe we should have a chair there that represents the activist and find a way to get people to listen. When you were saying about listening, I was recalling a town hall in which I tell people that God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth so that you could listen more than you speak. But that's a different problem. Most people don't listen enough.
I remember, Ajay, one of the first times I met you, we were sitting with the Performance Leader Advisory Board in Singapore. This is 2017. We had just experienced a surprising outcome in the Brexit referendum in the UK. We'd experienced a surprising outcome to some of us in the US presidential election. And we've been on a little bit of a journey as a community these past 4 years in really understanding how we can listen better, how we can listen better to voices that we don't have enough proximity to in many different ways. Are there things that Katharine's just laid out some really radical ideas for disrupting the way that we make decisions in companies. Are there other things that you think that you can imagine enabling from a Mastercard perspective?
Well, what I've found over time is that getting the young people in your company, listening to their voice makes a big difference. So if you conduct yourself with what I call decency, and that's a topic which we can go into. Decency is an interesting word. It means many things to many people, and that's actually the idea. But it all boils down to giving people a level playing field and bringing your heart and mind to work and letting them feel that your hand is on their back and not in their face. And if you do that enough and you get young people in the company to buy into that, their voices are a very strong voice because it feeds back into engagement surveys, it feeds back into their desire to be in the company, it feeds back into a lower attrition rate. And so it makes managers feel that this is a good outcome. And I found that to be the best energizing tool in my armory. By allowing these younger people to show with their voices that they cared about the things we were doing while succeeding in the workplace. And so finding a way to do well and do good, people talk about it all the time, but actually one way of doing it is to get young people involved in that process. And I just haven't thought about the idea of having a youth activist. That's quite an interesting idea of having somebody in an advisory position to you who will make you think 3 times about the things you're doing and saying, and just allow you to pause for a minute and say, wait a minute, there may be a different way to think about this. Mm-hmm. Actually, that's a brilliant idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, Katharine, we're just almost at the end of our time here, and we want to give everyone a chance to have a quick break before we go into our group discussions. But we've been talking a little bit about the next generation and how we can listen better, give voices to more people who aren't at the table yet. You also mentioned that you think it's important for us to think of ourselves as ancestors, and I wondered if you could leave us with a little bit more on what you mean by that.
Yeah. I think the sort of the sad truth about how we currently measure economic health is that we are literally selling the future in the present and rewarding ourselves by calling that GDP, right? Calling that something good. And I feel like, just to come all the way back to kind of the context we started with the pandemic, I feel like it's never been clearer that some of the needles that we pay attention to related to the economy are so profoundly disconnected from the day-to-day lives and well-being of people and communities, right? When the market can be soaring, right? And people are making choices about, whether they can keep the lights on or eat at the end of the month, right? Like, this is, I think we really have to, I think we have to think anew about what needles we're looking at to track how we're doing, right? And I think some of those could have certainly a more future orientation. I wish we heard as much about the parts per million in the atmosphere as we do about where the Dow closed today. And I think whether it's having a youth activist at the table or looking at a very different sort of dashboard, I think we need these shifts of the kaleidoscope so that our gaze is on the future and is on frankly different dimensions of the present.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you to all 3 of you, Ajay, Majora, and Katharine, for your generosity and being patient with the the work that you're all doing. It's been a lot of time that you've been thinking about this challenge of creating inclusive growth, and I think we all feel the frustration and the impatience that you bring at the same time as the hope that you have to show up to and apply to these challenges. So we'll just have to imagine that we're sitting in a room all together and everybody's able to give you a round of applause. But what we will do now is we'll go quickly to a break. I'll just mention in a few moments how that's going to work for everybody that's on our platform. So what will happen after this panel is we'll go out back to the virtual lobby. Everyone will have a chance for 15 minutes or so to grab a water, a coffee, a glass of wine, whatever time zone you're in. When you're in the lobby, if you don't need any of those things, you can go into the coffee corner and catch up with other people that are here. You can check out our virtual version of our mobile library and see what books other people have recommended on this topic of recovery and healing. And you can also leave a postcard for us or for another participant. We will come back from the break after 15 minutes, so that's 15 past the hour. And you'll all see a group that you've been put into. So you'll have a chance to click into that, and you'll be with, for most of you, a mystery collection of people that we think that you'll really enjoy and learn from and be able to give something to. So we hope you really enjoy the next session. We'll see you back here in plenary for the final half hour. Thanks very much, everybody.